I'm currently standing in a courtyard belonging to the United States House of Representatives. How did I get here? Why am I here? That's not important. About a year ago, in the very first video I ever uploaded to this channel, I said this: the Trump administration, short-lived and tumultuous though it was, did more to advance the scope of American ambitions in outer space than any presidential administration since Nixon. Now, with President Trump back in the White House and more than half a year into his second term, is that still the case? That's the question we'll be exploring in this video, along with taking an up-close and personal look at the future of international collaboration and relations in outer space. If you're looking for a simple yes or no answer to the question of whether President Trump remains a net positive force for space policy, I can save you some time. The answer to that question is an emphatic no. In fact, the way things are shaping up could prove to be disastrous. But in order to understand just how dire things could get in outer space, we have to wind the clock back to 1967 and the incipience of what is now known today as the Outer Space Treaty. In 1967, human activities in outer space were still in their infancy. It had only been a decade since the Soviet Union had successfully launched Sputnik, and the United States was just beginning to kick off its Apollo program. Even still, the United States and the Soviet Union, bitter foes and the two predominant space powers at the time, realized that they had to put aside their differences and get together and decide on what exactly the legal framework would be for activities in outer space. With the United Kingdom as their neutral arbiter, the two great powers got together and came up with the Outer Space Treaty, which enumerate, among other things, the existence of outer space as a shared commons, one which cannot be claimed or monopolized by any particular country, company, or individual. The Outer Space Treaty also held that space should be a domain of peace. To whatever extent that military involvement in space would occur, it would have to be peaceful, and there could not be any weapons of mass destruction or open conflicts in orbital space, on the moon, or anywhere else. Given that most international laws are very difficult, if not impossible, to enforce, many cynics would argue that the average treaty is really not worth more than the paper it's written on. So what makes the Outer Space Treaty so different? For one thing, there's the widespread adoption of it. Every single country with any kind of presence whatsoever in outer space has signed on to the Outer Space Treaty, alongside 100 other countries that haven't, bringing the total count of signatories up to about 130 at the last count. This list includes the United States, Russia, the European Union, the United Kingdom, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and even North Korea, which is very significant, given that North Korea has not even signed on to the UN Convention on Human Rights. Another thing that makes the Outer Space Treaty so different is the fact that it actually is legally binding. I'll let Antonio Salmeri explain exactly how that works.
Right. So this multi-level dimension means that the states themselves, they create the rules, they interpret and evolve them at the international level, at the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, with the support of the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs. But then they have to implement them at the national level to make sure that private actors can also engage in space activities. This is a key aspect. We're here at the Department of Commerce. So that function is because of Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, which we will see in a moment. Whatever a private company does, the government can be sued internationally and it will be responsible and liable for it, which is a big deal in international law. In space, that's the result of a compromise between the United States and the Soviet Union as to whether commercial and private actors were allowed to do any space activity. So the Soviet Union was more of the opinion that only state actors could do space activities. The US government wanted to have a possibility for commercial actors to get in. However, the compromise was that every commercial actor is always linked to a state actor, so that you have that multi-level dimension exactly because of that. However, through domestic legislation, states also interpret and implement space law. It means that by enacting a law, you're declaring what the position of your country is, in a way, and therefore you contribute to the evolution and shaping of international space law.
All right, so we got Catherine back in the stew, better known to some as Martin Zoomer King. And we're going to be talking about where space policy is headed right now. And in particular, I kind of want to look at the contrast between what I would consider the good space policy of the first Trump administration and what we're now seeing as evil space policy, as I would term it, or maybe, I don't know, dark Gothic MAGA space policy. um, the first Trump administration had its 7 space policy directives, the fourth of which probably being the most famous to the layman, that being the one that created the Space Force, the 6th branch of the military. And then probably the most consequential of which being the first space policy directive, which established the Artemis program, which would be, the return to the moon, establishment of a permanent presence, and then ultimately on to Mars. But this year, as Trump is back in the White House, we're seeing a very radically different pivot into a different direction with space policy, where currently NASA is without an officially appointed director. The Trump administration has released a budget request that basically brings NASA's budget down to the lowest it's been adjusted for inflation since 1961. And there's also a huge push now to militarize space to an unprecedented level. So that's what we're going to get into here. Kathy, you got anything to add?
Not really, honestly.
Okay. So let's talk about the budget cuts first. So the NASA budget is looking to be reduced, assuming that Congress goes along with the requested budget proposal, from an annual budget of $24.8 billion to $18.8 billion, or just shy of it, which makes a cut of more than a quarter of its original size. And of this, the science funding is going to be cut by 47%, so almost in half. And all the programs related to STEM education will be completely abolished. They'll be reduced down to $0, so functionally they cannot exist. And this is kind of paralleling a pattern that we're seeing across the administration with other categories of science spending. So we're seeing similar size cuts in NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. We're seeing it in the National Science Foundation, the NSF. We're seeing it at the National Institute of Health, NIH. And it sort of raises this big question because the Trump administration has kind of branded itself around this abstract idea of peace through strength. And that's something that sounds good maybe on a bumper sticker, but when it gets down to the brass tacks of what the hell that actually means, we're kind of left scratching our head. And the reason why I say this, and it's especially pertinent when it comes to space policy, is because scientific research is really a big international unifier. We have a lot of issues with, China. We've historically, and I would say still have issues with Russia. But at the end of the, yeah,
We're actually not allowed to do. We don't do space research cooperation with China.
That's fair. But we're kind of getting to a secondary point here. I'm just saying that historically, scientific funding for international space science has been kind of a unifier. It was the basis of the Outer Space Treaty, which was ratified in 1967. And at that time, obviously, the United States and the Soviet Union were very much in the throes of the Cold War. But even still, there was this agreement as all these politicians sat down that, space was going to be the domain for everyone, that it wouldn't belong to just one country, and that it would not be a battleground, that war would not belong in space. It would be only used for peaceful cooperation. So we're seeing this issue where international science is kind of being starved of its funding. But at the same time, they're throwing a lot of money into deterrence or defense or weaponry in outer space. And the United States has never really had weaponry in space in this way that they're looking to propose it. There was a brief time in the 1980s where they were looking to do the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars. But the general idea is that, what's up in space is usually supposed to be for scientific benefit or for public use or whatever. And now the Trump administration is looking to develop something called the Golden Dome. which is sort of being conceptualized as this orbital network of satellites that are armed with interceptor missiles. And this is kind of in the context of all these concerns that maybe Russia or China will put weapons in space. And so now they're kind of saying, well, the cat's out of the bag. Let's just do it first. And in response, we're seeing some indications of retaliation from Russia and China that they maybe want to match us in this kind of endeavor. And then maybe we have an arms race going on in space or what have you. So, Catherine, what do you kind of think is going on with Golden Dome? I mean, what's your opinion on this kind of militarization of space and everything?
So I think you're a little bit off the mark in categorizing space as being only for civilian purposes. Since the beginning of the space program, there's always been a military aspect to it. The first rocket capable of reaching space was the V2 ballistic missile.
Right.
And that was only repurposed for civilian use in 1946 after the end of the war. And that's really continued since then, where most space research originally originated from the military industrial complex. For example, the first satellite in space was Sputnik, right? But you didn't know the rocket Sputnik was carried on, the actual big thing that they were trying to develop, that was developed as an intercontinental ballistic missile.
Right.
And so, that's just the origins of space. There's always been a military connection to space. And you can argue that, there haven't been orbital weapons, but that would also not be true. There have been orbital weapons in the past. For example, Soviets launched armed space stations in the 1970s. The Almaz series, they had machine guns on them from the back of bombers. They were supposed to defend them against American space weapons. And then the space shuttle was also intended for some military uses. There was a capability in the space shuttle design documents that made it essentially able to intercept and take down a satellite, because it was supposed to basically able to be launched from Vandenberg, which is a U.S. Air Force station, right? And they had a shuttle launcher at Vandenberg. They would launch it on Air Force missions, and they had a requirement that it could launch there, go up into polar orbit, intercept a satellite, come back and land at Vandenberg. That was one of the main requirements of the shuttle program. And what the Soviets saw this, and they were like, oh, we need to make our own shuttle, because they were worried that we would use this as a nuclear first strike technique.
Right.
And, they developed their own shuttle, and that was explicitly intended for a military purpose. Yeah, there's a civilian contingent of it, but the main reason they funded this was for the military. And I think that it's somewhat inaccurate to state that civilian space has only been intended for civilian uses, when that's not true. Another thing is satellites, space-based surveillance. That's a huge deal.
Yeah.
The Corona program, if you know what that is, it's not the virus, but there was an effort by the CIA in the 1960s to build the first photo reconnaissance satellites, and that cost close to around very close to how much the Apollo program cost. And they would do some very crazy stuff in this program, but these satellites are what led up to a lot of modern day innovations, GPS. GPS came from actually originated in a way to locate ballistic missiles, locate submarine-based ballistic missiles. You locate the location of the submarine, so you can hit that. The Soviets would want to take that out in World War III. So, I think it's a little bit inaccurate to state that there have been no militarization of space before this.
Let me attempt to steelman my position, because I'm not claiming that there has never been a militarization of space. What I am saying is that the way that the Trump administration is trying to allocate resources towards, space is predominantly military focused and particularly weaponized in a way that we haven't really seen. So obviously we've definitely seen a lot of surveillance, that I'm not really contesting. But the notion that there could be missiles launched from orbital satellites and that there are actually going to be a lot of them and that we're sinking $200 billion into it. And as a large part of the way that we're financing it, we're getting rid of a lot of our international collaborations in terms of scientific research. I think that it's painting us into a position where we're going to see an increase in geopolitical tensions just naturally. I see this as kind of the start or maybe part of a chain reaction of escalatory moves, which I think is an unwelcome development for the future of space research and use in space.
Sometimes, again, we look at it from a perspective of what are we going to get for taxpayers' money in the United States, which is a legitimate question. And I think, again, it's about messaging. So much of these cuts, I think, would be reconsidered if you really understand and we are better at communicating the benefits that we get out of these activities. Also, in terms of international leadership, space continues to be a place where many countries look at the United States for leadership of technology development, but also policy development. And cutting these programs dramatically will have negative consequences on the reliability of the United States as a partner. Whatever the reason may be domestically, there is an international aspect to it that needs to be considered.
In particular, we're looking at the future of manned travel and use of the moon. And the United States is trying to get the rest of the world on board with the Artemis Accords, which, delineate exactly how the moon ought to be used in a tangible way, in terms of commercial use, in terms of government use. And, it's very crucial that everyone kind of abide by the same general idea of what's going on up there when it comes to maintaining safe use and communications of certain important data. When it comes to resolving and arbitrating disputes, having a universal framework is really helpful. But what we're seeing is a kind of bifurcation of space coalitions. I mean, now there's obviously always been some tension between the United States and China, and there's been some tension between the United States and Russia, but the Chinese and Russians are going off and creating their own framework, and they're not going to want to come to the table if we're not doing anything collaboratively with them because we're starving all that stuff of its funding. And we are more and more exclusively using outer space as a warfighting domain.
If we look at the militarization aspect of the moon, it's first of all illegal, given that Article 4.2 of the Outer Space Treaty prescribes that the moon shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. It prohibits any military installation for the purpose of, weaponizing the moon or weaponizing assets on the moon. So number one, it would be already an infringement of international space law. And number two, it wouldn't really fulfill the purpose. Shooting each other on the moon is not a great idea. It's not going to bring anybody anywhere. So I would hope that we find a way to talk to each other and to agree on basic rules so that the incentivization aspect is there in a way that you're not going to feel the need for someone to watch your back with a rifle, with a laser, or whatever military instrument is. That is not to say that I'm rejecting completely military involvement in lunar activities. If it's done for exclusively peaceful purposes, as, for example, some of the work that DARPA wants to do, it's just financing research or financing technology development that does not have any military component in it, then I think that's perfectly fine. It's good that we find integration. Most civilian technologies are derived from that. But I'm worried about this becoming a rhetorical point, a principal point that then can escalate easily, and it would then prejudice any economy. If there is people shooting on the moon, there is no economy on the moon. And so I think that's a key aspect that I would hope we don't get wrong.
If you would have let me finish.
Okay.
I was going to say that I understand your main point was the issue of proliferation and normalization of space-based military technology.
Right.
And I agree that's an issue.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that, like my point was more that this is going to happen anyways. Like there's going to be space-based weapons in the future. I'm sorry, but that's just a fact. We already have a lot of these capabilities. And my main argument against like the Golden Dome stuff isn't that, it would cause a proliferation of space-based weapons. It's my point that space-based weapons are kind of stupid. They're not very effective, and they're not like a good investment. I think scientific research is just a better investment in our country's future. Like I'm not gonna like.
Yeah, on that point, we can definitely agree.
It's the issue of creating an arms, like you're concerned about an arms race, right?
Precisely, yes.
And that's where I think you're wrong, because I don't think there would be very much of an arms race, because they wouldn't be very effective. They wouldn't be very effective weapons beyond what we already have, and beyond what we've already tested.
Right.
Like the most effective space-based weapons are the ones we already have.
Well, the important question then is, do you think that...
I think that if we deployed a space-based weapon, the Chinese probably wouldn't do it.
Well, they have at least publicly stated that they are working on trying to do something that would match what we're doing. I think there's kind of this big open question, which is...
Let me be more clear with you. I think that either nations have already deployed types of weapons that would intercept satellites. I think that's a very like realistic type of weapon.
Yes.
But the Golden Dome, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about like an ICBM interception system. And most countries don't want an ICBM interception system, firstly. And secondly, we already have an ICBM interception system.
Right.
More effective than what he's proposing.
Yes. Yeah. Again, on that point, we can agree. The problem with the Golden Dome, as we're seeing it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, is that these satellites that are on these fixed orbital trajectories can only cover certain aspects of the globe, right? Only certain parts of the land. And so you end up having to have a whole bunch of them all over the place, which is very expensive. And, when we're looking at concerns with high densities of satellites and, collision avoidance risks being, precipitating into the future, having these gigantic swarms with explosive ordnance on them is maybe not such a good idea when we have ground-based platforms that are able to cover a much larger range, are significantly cheaper and far more practical.
So there's two approaches to like a space-based interception system. There's basically where you use individual satellites as kinetic attack weapons, which would require a large swarm. Or you have something that's covering a very specific geographic area. In the United States' case, that would be geosynchronous orbit over the continental United States or the Pacific Ocean or something like that. And any kind of satellite that actually like wants to cover like significant areas, like you either want it to be geosynchronous or you want it to be in LEO. You don't want it to be in a medium orbit.
Right.
And the main thing about geosynchronous orbit is that even though a missile platform would be most effective at that position, when you're at geosynchronous orbit, when you fire a missile, it's going to take longer than it takes that ballistic missile to hit its target for you to get your interceptor missile to it.
Yeah.
Like with ballistic missile interception technology now, the ballistic missile is coming towards you, so you don't really need to worry about like timing the interception beyond
right.
It.
It's going to lose the race to get there.
Right. So during the SDI initiative in the 1980s, which was Reagan's Star Wars, the main proposal was actually a laser-based system, which eliminates the issue where you would you have a big platform, geosynchronous orbit, and then you would basically use it as you just shoot a laser off of it, and that would be a big chemical laser, basically.
My understanding from the scant documentation that the Trump administration has presented so far is that the Golden Dome is not going to be laser-based, that it is going to be physical interceptor missiles.
Right, and if you're launching a missile off of a platform, right, you're going to have either a lot of platforms, like you said, you would either have to have a lot of platforms, or you'd have to have missiles that go like 10% of the speed of light, basically.
Yeah.
Like, really fast.
Like hypersonic, which,
like,
yeah.
Much,
if we got
much
that technology, we might as well be putting it on the ground anyway.
And the thing is that like if you do the math for this kind of station, it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
The math doesn't work because if you need to accelerate a projectile that much, you're going to be putting so much fuel in this like in this like warhead that you may as well just like launch a bunch more satellites with the payload you have.
Yeah.
Like, it's just it's a stupid proposal.
Yes,
it's
it is a stupid proposal,
and it's made to make Trump look strong and awesome and badass.
Yeah,
and it's just.
So this again is where we can get to a point where I think we wholeheartedly agree with each other, which is that this notion of peace through strength as it's being practiced is very flimsy. And the idea of strength that they're looking to project is very primitive. It's a very primitive notion of what is strength, which is, we have more guns and more troops than the other guys. And it doesn't really get any further than that. And
he's focusing, it's a focus on aesthetics, and it's a focus on like ineffective solutions that look cool, that is very, very, it's very unique to this administration.
Yes. And of course, we saw it with the recent, military parade in DC. And someone in the space community, probably associated with the Planetary Society, was pointing out that just the simple cost of that military parade would be enough to fund the New Horizons probe, which NASA, if they get this cut down budget, would have to cancel for 3 or almost 4 years. So, and New Horizons is one of the 40 scientific missions that's currently ongoing that would have to shutter itself, again, assuming that these budget cuts come in. And that's the one that is the furthest out in the solar system of anything we've ever sent. It's studying the Kuiper Belt. We're trying to learn more about how gravity works out there, and it still works just fine. All it needs is a little bit of money every year in order to have people who can process the data. And that's being shuttered, potentially, if this budget goes through, which it very well might. The Juno probe, which is going around Jupiter, is another example of one that is looking to be shuttered. And again, that's very useful data that it's collecting, because the next probe that we're sending to that system is not going to get there for another 5 years with Europa Clipper. So the time and the money that is being lost and ultimately wasted from these cuts, which ultimately amount to micro pennies on the dollar, if they want to come up with some sort of like deficit-based justification for why they're making them. It's really just kind of astounding. And it's also losing us another kind of strength, which is soft power, in the form of having cutting edge scientific knowledge and being a good country for people to come in and work and do scientific research. This is a very unwelcome administration as far as scientific research is concerned. And the Chinese, if we're concerned about these great power competitions, are going to be swooping in and scooping up as many scientists and researchers as they possibly can in the power vacuum that's being created by this.
I think this administration was so scatterbrained that it wasn't even intending to do this when it came into office.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there was a whole this has been forgotten in the news cycle, but there was like an order in the Pentagon like a while ago that was said, oh yeah, prepare a list of things we can cut. So we can cut 50% of the Pentagon budget.
Right.
This was like a whole thing they prepared, and now they're upping the budget by $200
right. Yeah. Yes.
Like, it reeks of just a lack of forethought, a lack of planning, and a lack of vision. And honestly, that's the most embarrassing part about it, is that we're shutting down these like already operational probes and already operational science missions. Like, another one they're shutting down is the Mars Odyssey orbiter, and that orbiter is like one of the only ways we can contact Mars rovers we have.
Yep.
Like, if that gets shut down, we can't contact the nuclear Mars rovers that will be deployed to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's just a lack of forethought, a lack of vision, and it reeks of just a cynical incompetence
Yeah.
that has permeated the entire administration.
Hmm.
And he basically like the charlatan yes men that the president has surrounded himself with.
Yeah. And I think that brings us at this point naturally to the discussion about the NASA administrator and who that's going to be. Um, because, yeah, there has been such a massive lack of consistency about what the Trump administration's plan is for really anything. And one of the ways that we're supposed to be able to ameliorate that is by having someone who is designated by the administration to be in charge of NASA and to communicate to the employees and to communicate to the middle management people exactly how they're going to execute the president's vision. And, even if the president's vision is something that is completely, counterintuitive or just piss poor, having someone who can help orchestrate that is better than not by a large country mile. But right now there's no leadership at all. There's Janet Petro, who is the acting administrator, but in her capacity as an acting administrator, there's really nothing she can do beyond just kind of take orders and just keep the can moving along the road, and yeah, it's kind of a hot mess.
See, I think that's the thing, though. Trump prefers the acting directors to the actual ones.
Mm.
Because, as you said, all they can do is follow orders and kick the can down the road.
Yeah.
And, that feels very, very much like what the kind of thing he does and the kind of thing he likes.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
I would say that
basically make it be someone else's problem in the future to figure out how to clean up his mess.
Like I don't think he even wants a new administrator. I think that he doesn't like NASA. I don't think he likes the space program beyond. He doesn't like anything that doesn't project his big macho North Korea guy energy.
Right.
He wants to be Kim Jong-un.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of person he idolizes, and it's sad that we decided to elect this guy, and we decided to screw over these highly accomplished scientists, these highly accomplished people, these really like smart people in NASA. We screwed them over in favor of what? Cheaper eggs, and then we didn't even get the cheaper eggs.
Right.
So
yeah, it's a hot mess. Yeah, and not only is it people in the United States who are, being laid off en masse, people with astrophysics doctorates and years and years of dedication to public service and good science. It's not just stateside, but our allied countries and their researchers are on the hook for this too. Within the European Space Agency, within Japan, within India, and pretty much every other country that we are collaborating in space with, and even to a certain extent, Russia. The lack of clarity, the lack of direction, and the constant, pivoting, the constant changing of course without any follow-up explanation, it affects more than just the United States. It affects pretty much the whole world. And our collective output as a species in terms of the knowledge that we're developing, the technologies that we can produce. I mean, there's just a lot of opportunity cost being totally lost here. And it's very unfortunate because this is an administration that was making such big hay about having governmental efficiency, and we're seeing instead that at every turn, the more that they get involved with the functions of government, the worse those functions end up being executed once they're done with it, right? Not just NASA, but pretty much all across the board. A lot of this stuff that's like manned spaceflight actually could be done within the private sector. It's the public funding of research that private companies are not going to turn around and fund because they don't have a profit incentive to do it. It's the educational initiatives that there's no profit incentive to do. But they're cutting everything except for human spaceflight, and they're increasing the budget on that, which is just strange.
Well, I think saying that private companies I think that's the whole point though. Like that private companies can go to space. The whole point, he wants to make NASA a money funnel from the government to private companies. That's what he wants. And I know his clash with Elon has happened recently, and I don't know whether that's still the goal. But I think that he hates NASA, and I think this might even be because of sorry, no cursing, but this might even be because of Mike Pence.
Yeah.
You know about their falling. They had their falling out. Right?
They certainly did after January 6th with
Absolutely.
the Capitol insurrection. And for those who don't know, the space policy stuff was Mike Pence's little bugbear. That was his project. He was overseeing the White House Space Council and all of those initiatives, Space Force, Artemis. These were all things that were kind of his little passion project. Yeah. I mean, it's entirely possible. There's most likely some sort of personal vindictive element to it, because that's kind of how
I would say that it's a combination of personal vindictiveness and greed and short-sighted, egotistical decision making. And really we're such a fucking technologically advanced. We we land on the fucking moon, okay? We build stealth bombers by the hundreds. There's no other country that has the technological resources that we have, and we're just but these projects, they need foresight and they need to be actually planned correctly. Have actual funding goals. There's, for example, the F-22 Raptor, which was the main fighter jet the U.S. military purchased. The initial synthesis, the initial idea for this fighter jet originated in late 1970s, right? This fighter jet didn't become operational until 2005.
Right.
So 35 years from the concept to building this jet. The jet's an amazing airplane, right? But it needed the time to cook, the ability to actually develop this aircraft.
Yes.
Rather than just
Yes.
just saying, "Oh, we're an epic fighter jet."
And yeah, exactly. Science is an iterative process. It doesn't always produce returns immediately. And again, this is why it's so important that there is public support and that it be bipartisan and universal across the board. Because, if we drop the ball, we can't even really just pick up where we left off the next time an administration comes in that is pro-science. There's a lot of institutional knowledge that gets lost when people take jobs elsewhere because they're not sure when the next paycheck's going to show up. There is momentum that gets killed and you have to, come back to it. There's information that may be outdated by the time you try to restart, and now you have to do inquiries all over again and run tests and basically reinvent the wheel. And that is another huge problem we're seeing, where whenever something doesn't immediately produce big bombastic returns on investment, the Trump administration wants to kill it. And, they're killing in the cradle a lot of really good things because there's no patience, there's no respect for norms and continuity and all these other things. It really is we just came into the White House and we're just going to throw everything up in the air and, we'll figure out what we want to pick up later, which is
a really great example of this is actually the Qatara Jet Deal. So you probably know about this. Trump accepted this big 747 from Qatar to make a new Air Force One. The only problem with that was that this aircraft, there's no way they're going to have the capabilities of the actual Air Force One by the time he leaves office. So in his first presidency, Trump bought two ex-airline 747s to be converted into the new Air Force Ones, right? And this was in 2017.
Yeah.
And now here we are in 2025, and those jets are slated to come online in 2027, right? So, it took 9 years for these jets, right?
Yeah, almost 10.
right? But somehow he's going to have this jet Qatar converted before 2027 into the same standard,
Yeah.
into this like he's basically like it's pointless.
Mhm.
It's a pointless thing. It's all just ego. It's
Yep.
ego, and it's a lack of understanding of how anything works.
Pretty much. And of course, at his inaugural address, he said that we were going to put a man on Mars, right? And this has been the big thing that he and Elon have been obsessed with, and it's about the only thing they care about NASA doing. But it's probably it's most certainly the one thing that we are absolutely not going to be accomplishing during his time in office.
Definitely not.
We weren't going to do it before. And we definitely aren't going to do it now that the science funding is being pulled, because there's this big open question of how do you even get people, human beings, in a rocket for that long across that distance, which is kind of a scientific question. And, a lot of others, secondary questions that come with it, like what are they going to do when they get on the surface? And all of those questions are kind of just being thrown out the window. And they're just going to throw more money at Starship and more rockets for Elon Musk to blow up, which is, again, a disaster.
Congratulations to him, by the way. It's only been 60 years since the N1. So building another one is just like wow, what a historic throwback.
Right.
Big rocket with tons of engines that has propulsion troubles that explodes on pad 50 times.
Well, yeah, we're surpassing their record, though. We're going to blow up a lot more times.
History of the Super Bowl.
Yeah. First is tragedy, then is farce, right?
And so we should be having a good messaging so that we communicate to the public that this is not a billionaire playground. This is not a colonization 2.0. This is not a war in space or Star Wars. Something that is for the good of humanity, that can deliver incredibly immense benefits, and that we're trying to do it right.
You have been watching Talk Kevin.